Yeah, okay. So pretty much okay, let me make you the guys for this, Geoff.
No, it's okay. Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, and I think people's gonna hop in when I see people's coming in now.
Got it.
Let's start in like 3 minutes. Oh, Rick is here. Hey, Rick. And George
Jeff,
is
it's
here.
nice to see you, and thank you for doing this.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We'll see. This is after graduation when everybody's on vacation, so we'll see who is actually still working.
Well, no worries.
Yeah, we will record this. Yeah, so
I think
this will be online.
No, it's certainly very timely, and I think a lot of people will be interested. I am actually in the middle of dinner, so if I'm not showing my screen, that doesn't mean that I won't be paying attention.
It's quite all right. I rushed my dinner about 10 minutes ago, so I totally get where you are. It's all good.
But anyway,
yeah. So shall we get started? I think we can get started, and we have the session record, right? Yes. Okay. So if you don't mind, we can start now, Geoff.
Sure. Did you want to do any sort of introduction, Pinyan?
Yeah, I mean, it's a small audience today. I think it's probably because first it's after graduation's vacation time for everybody, and also it's dinner time, or maybe the thunderstorm at whatever area you are in. So yeah, but still, we appreciate you for coming here, Geoff, to make this presentation. It's actually quite exciting based on your who you're working for, the Federal Realty in the pandemic period. It's the commercial area is quite a struck right now. So so I will just let you have the platform, and you may make the presentation. So the entire thing should be very conversational. So if anybody, and it's a small audience, so anybody has the questions, and we can just ask ahead in the chat, or you can just raise your hand, and I will let you ask your questions and after the presentation today. So yeah. So Geoff, it's all yours.
Great. Well, I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see. Here we go. And oops. Sorry. Give me a second. There we go. Does that look right?
Yes.
Yep. Great. Well, so everyone, a small group, but thanks very much for inviting me this evening. My name is Geoff Sharpe. I'm the Vice President for Creative Planning and Development at Federal Realty. And I am a GSD grad. I got my MLA back in 2000, go through the MLA1 program. And, for a long time, I've been interested in urbanism and city making, and also real estate development, which is what I've spent most of my time doing in the 20 years since I graduated from Harvard. So what I'd like to do this evening, and this is, as Pinyan said, intended to be conversational. So please raise your hand, put questions in the chat. We'll try and respond as we go along. But what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about Federal Realty in terms of what we do and why we do it. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I do for the company specifically. And perhaps this is, interesting for you folks who are students or recent grads, sort of how I got from being an MLA student, 20 plus years ago, to working real estate development today. So I'm going to settle that. Let's see. So Federal Realty, we are a publicly traded real estate investment trust. We were founded in 1962. We're on the S&P 500. We trade under FRT, Today, coming out of COVID, we've got a market cap of about $9 billion US. We own just over 100 properties, although we closed on 2 more earlier this week, so that's now got up to 103. We have about a 23 million square foot retail portfolio. That's about 2,800 retail tenants. We also, unlike a number of other REITs in the industry, we are a mixed use REIT. We own about just under 3,000 residential units as well as just over 2 million square feet of office. From an income perspective, what that means is we get about 80% of our cash flow, or NOI, from retail, about 10% from residential, and 10% from office. And frankly, as we've gone through the enjoyable times of COVID over the past years, those two income streams have been very beneficial because they haven't been quite so challenged as some of the retail has been. So that's Federal Realty. Our portfolio is it's entirely domestic in the US. It's mainly bi-coastal, some major urban markets, kind of DC and north up to Boston, some in South Florida. We have a fairly significant footprint in California as well, both in Southern California and in the Bay Area. And then we own a few assets in Chicago and one just outside of Detroit as well. So that's us. And in terms of, where we like to invest, and this is, I think, true of a lot of folks in our space, we like markets that have strong demographics, right? So dense, well-educated, a decent amount of disposable income. We like markets, frankly, where it's hard to develop, where it's hard to do things, high barriers to entry. And that is certainly true of all the coastal markets that we're in, whether it's Southern California or Washington, D.C. or Boston. It's not easy to get stuff built. Entitlement's challenging, land values are high, sites are already developed, they have existing leaseholds in place already. There's lots of complexity with redeveloping or developing sites in these regions. But, we have a competitive advantage because we think we have a team that knows how to do that. They can get those kinds of development done. It's also, frankly, from a purely self-interested point of view, I would tell you that if you're interested in urbanism and placemaking, it's also more interesting, more fun to do sort of high density, complex development. So I'm going to show you a couple projects, a couple assets that have been developed by Federal Realty, 3 in particular. And folks, I think you'll definitely be familiar with the second one and probably the first as well. The third, maybe not so much. The first is Santana Row. This was first phase is opened in 2002. This is in Southern California. It's in Silicon Valley. Sorry, it's Bay Area, Silicon Valley, so San Jose. It is if you haven't been there, it's a beautiful center. It's mostly mid-rise. Program is around 2 million square feet. That's around a third retail, another third office, and just over 800 residential units. There's also a 200-key hotel. Now, one of the things I would tell you about Santana, we'll go to a site plan. And this is true for, I think, some other folks who kind of operate in this space that we compete with. When we think about a large, multi-phased, mixed-use development like Santana Row, in a way, we're kind of teeing up the gift that's going to keep on giving. And by that, I mean, by coming into a neighborhood and kind of transforming what that neighborhood or that place is, whether it's, existing light industrial or existing vacant lots. We're really changing the kind of the brand and the market dynamics in the neighborhood because we have a critical mass to sort of work on. And that also means that adjacent parcels, as we pick them up, in a way become land banks where we have future development phases down the road. So right now, for example, at Santana, even though, as I said, phase 1 opened in 2002, we're looking to bring additional office online in the next 12 months. And again, that'll be just another source of income that goes down to our bottom line. And that's true with most of our large mixed-use assets. That's Santana Row. Assembly Row. So this is not too far from, if folks are actually in Cambridge right now, this is not too far from where folks are sitting. And I was actually up there a couple weeks ago to see it for the first time. So when I was at GSD, I lived in Somerville, and the notion that over at Assembly Square on the other side of 93, that this giant brownfield, if you know the site history, it's a former Ford Motor Company manufacturing facility that closed in, I think, 1958, something like that. It's an Albert Kahn building. But the notion that that would transform into sort of this really interesting example of mixed-use urbanism with a ton of investment and a new T-stop, you know, that would have been laughable. I mean, that place was a disaster. But since then, you know, for a number of reasons, partly Federal Realty is doing, partly because of efforts in the local community, there's been a real impetus to redevelop the site. Federal Realty picked it up back in, gosh, I'm going to forget exactly when it was, but around 2005. We sort of struck our deal with the local community in 2007. And we opened phase one. You know, we paused, as I think a lot of people did with the Great Recession in 2008 through 2012. And we opened phase one in 2014. It's also just over, it's actually a little bit more than 2 million square feet, but it's a couple million square feet, about 500,000 square feet of retail. There's existing about 700,000 feet of office there today, including Puma North America's headquarters, which is just wrapping up construction. There's more office space planned. There's about 800 residential units. There's a new residential tower that's just wrapping up construction and opening in the next 12 months. There's a boutique hotel, which is very nice. There's the T-stop, which I think, you know, came to being in large part because of, you know, investment in the area. And it is a dramatic improvement over what was there before in terms of being a brownfield, surface parked, low density, you know, zero tax revenue coming into Somerville, you know, big change. So that's a second example. Now, yeah, and here's the site plan, right? If you've been over there, north is more or less up and to the left. The blue on the left side is the Mystic River. 93 would be sort of at the bottom of the page in this shot, and the T-stop's top and middle. So that's the plan. And then I'm going to show just one more. You know, as I said, we're primarily a retail company. And although, you know, a lot of the assets that we own or a number of the assets we own are these, you know, dense, urban, higher profile assets like Assembly Row, Santana Row, Bethesda Road down where I live. We do also own a, you know, significant portfolio of suburban grocery anchored shopping centers. And, you know, they also are located in, you know, sort of high barriers to entry, highly educated places with a lot of disposable income. And so that means that we can do things like, you know, drive rents over time to increase value. And those rents allow us to do things like redevelop the center when it gets tired. Just to show you what this center, and this is in Virginia, just for reference, it's Springfield, Virginia, so just south of DC. To give you a sense of what it looked like before, this was 3 years ago. Pretty tired, you know, sort of cedar shake, mansard roof, beautiful example of like, you know, 1960s shopping centers. And, you know, it was tired. It needed some help with re-tenanting. And by investing, I think we invested $4 million here to kind of reskin the thing. You know, it's really significant change. We really had some fun with placemaking, more contemporary architecture, having, you know, a more thoughtful approach to the relationship between retail program and outdoor space. Really what this comes down to, you know, from an investment point of view, we're trying to create places where our customers actually want to spend time. We know that when people spend more time at our properties, whether again, it's a large complex property like Assembly Row or even a more prosaic one like Old Keene Mill, we know that if they want to come here, they will spend money with our tenants, and that will help us drive rents over the long term. So there's a very kind of clear connection in our mind between investing in, you know, well-designed places where the public wants to go and spend time and the resulting financial returns. For us, that's an easy layup, if you will. So those are 3 properties. And I would tell you, you know, from our point of view corporately, and, you know, so I just as a sidebar, I joined Federal Realty about a year ago. Before that, I was with a private REIT called Edens. And actually, I can see one of my old colleagues is also on the phone, David Jermakian. So I'm expecting some hard questions from David. You know, what I would tell you is that there's a common thread, which is attractive to me as a designer, that drives why, you know, we invest in these properties, why we make them the way they are, right? The very first thing is a focus on design, right? It's a real commitment to high quality architecture, to thoughtful streetscape, landscape design. And for me, as although my degree is in landscape architecture, I'm sort of at heart an urbanist and an urban designer. It's really good urban design. It's sort of very thoughtful about massing and scale and program and open space and connectivity and all those things that are really important for building cities, which is what this really is, a lot of it. Merchandising is another huge piece of what we do. We're well aware that, retail, shopping in the United States can be a bit of a depressing prospect sometimes. If you go to some places, some projects, you're likely to see the same tenant mix everywhere. And, whether that's on the soft goods side with apparel, or if it's on the food and bev side, where it's like, oh, great, we can go to Chili's and Olive Garden and, all those guys. Yet again, that I think is less and less interesting to our customers and the people who want to come shop at our centers. So we make a very intentional effort to attract not just national tenants who have great credit and who you can really rely on their guarantee and the fact that you've got a contract with them, they're going to pay real long term. You can take, frankly, a little more risk with our merchandising mix and include local tenants, mom and pops, whether they're on the food and bev side or they sell accessories or something like that. We can have those folks in the mix, and frankly, that program makes the places that we build much more interesting and much more authentic, right? So merchandising, I would say, is the second thing. The third thing is community connections. And that can be as simple as, finding out what the local community needs and wants, just from an entitlement point of view, right? When you negotiate these entitlements for these big projects, having an understanding of what the community needs are is incredibly important. But it can also go beyond that to doing joint programming with local neighborhood associations so they can have events in our open space. That can be doing things like, at Assembly Row, the local team supports a number of nonprofits in Somerville and Medford, addressing things like, food insecurity and homelessness. Those things are really important. We really do see ourselves, and as members of the community, we want to do the right thing. And I think that that's also, frankly, part of the brand of us being good neighbors, right? And again, leads to people wanting to shop at and visit our centers. And the fourth thing, I didn't talk about this too much, but you may have seen a few hints in some of the images. Sustainability. It's a huge thing. Increasingly, it's in the United States. It's a set of issues that's being enforced, promulgated through the building code, through zoning, and so on. But at the same time, doing the right thing in terms of, green building, in terms of LEED certification, in terms of, urban heat island. And, we have, for example, a pretty significant solar energy portfolio that we own. We've invested close to $50 million in the past 5 years in solar energy, almost all rooftop in various markets, and we're going to continue to do that. And for us corporately, that's incredibly important, right? Because it's part of our brand and who we are. And I would also tell you, again, as a little sidebar, when investors on Wall Street look at companies like Federal Realty, it is increasingly the case that we get asked hard questions about our ESG goals. What exactly are we doing, to address greenhouse gas emissions? What exactly are we doing to think more carefully about embodied carbon in the buildings that we build? So those are all real things that we actually deal with on a day-to-day basis. And again, personally, coming from a design background, I think that's great. It's sort of a value that I really appreciate. Okay, so what do I do at Federal Realty? So the main thing, and this is the reason I was hired about a year ago, is it's my role to kind of comb through our portfolio, those 100 properties that I alluded to earlier, and kind of find really value add opportunities, places where we can convert one use to another, right? Because the old use just no longer has a real economic future to it. It can be infilling, right? We might own, for example, a strip center that's just outside of town. There's a disused parking lot in the back because we have too much retail everywhere in America, right? And I think the metric is that in the United States, we have 26 square feet of retail per capita. The next country behind that, I think, is Canada at 17, then Australia at 11, and then the rest of the world is sort of sub 7. And so we have way more retail than we need in this country. We really do. And so that means that, in cases where we have these older suburban community shopping centers, there's an opportunity to take some parking lots back, convert them into residential, convert them into housing. I mean, the other thing about being bi-coastal in terms of our market exposure is that's where the housing affordability crisis is in the United States. So if we can build more housing, that's a great use to put on the sites. And along with that goes densification, right? Like, as rents go up, as land values go up, it's much easier for us to densify and again, mine those existing assets for value. So that's a lot of that's the main reason that I'm at Federal. I've been having a lot of fun doing it so far. And I wanted to show you just two projects that I've been working on. I'm not going to tell you where they are or what they're called. I'm just going to show them to you to give you a sense of the kind of thing that, if you were interested in following a similar path, you could work on the X number of years. So the first one, this is a garden apartment complex. It's just outside of a major metro. It's 14 acres. It's built in about 1960, 283 units, and I think 9 buildings. The adopted master plan by the community would allow us to go to 1.5 FAR, right? So if you do the math on 14 acres, that's just over 1,000 units. And so, we've been working with a local consultant to plan some interesting infill development. This is also right next to a light rail station that should be coming online in the next 5 years. So this is kind of classic transit-oriented development, right? Like infrastructure goes in, station opens up, land values start to go up. We can justify, the investment in, building a project like this, which might be for us like a $300 million investment. And it's, certainly we're not going to build this all at once, right? If you think about the absorption rate for residential units, it's going to take a long time to absorb 1,000 units. So this is probably 3 or 4 phases over time. And again, I mentioned earlier, we like these larger projects where over time, you just take down additional parcels. And again, you're sort of over time bringing on more income. This is one of those projects where we'd have that opportunity. So that's one of them. The second one, this is an urban project. It's, again, I'm not going to tell you where it is or what it's called, but this is called an urban vertically stacked power center. So at street level, you've got 3 2-story tenants. Underground, you've got 1 single plate tenant, and below that, you've got a level of parking. Now, this retail is just anachronistic and out of date. There is no need in an urban center for a retail asset like this, where you've got these giant plates that are frankly really inflexible for conversion to other uses. The plate here is about 200 feet deep. That doesn't work for shop retail at all. It's a big fat plate. It doesn't work for residential. It doesn't really work for office. The question is, what the heck do you do with it? And the big idea is to essentially scrape the building above grade, reuse the bathtub, right, the retaining walls and the structure below grade as new parking, and then to build a high-rise residential tower on top. We're getting the keys back from a bunch of the retail tenants, so this is actually, not too challenging to pull off. If you compare the section on the right, it's actually 180 degrees from the section I showed earlier. But you can see street on the left, retail at grade, residential tower, stepping down to the residential behind. So this would be a fun little urban design architectural project, which probably take us 4 years. But that's the kind of thing, again, that I get to work on at Federal Realty. In terms of how I got here, so when I was at the GSD, in addition to, so I was in MLA 1. So I had my 4 semesters of, core studios and a couple semesters of option studios. I really concentrated on kind of 2 things in terms of electives at the GSD. One was getting as much exposure to urban design as I could, right? So both my option studios were larger scale urban design because that's just where my interest was. And then also taking coursework both at the Kennedy School and at MIT, kind of around real estate development. So a bunch of real estate finance courses, things like that. That was very helpful in terms of kind of not just broadening my horizon in terms of what I was interested in, but also just in meeting other people who, much as I like designers, they weren't designers. So, sort of broadening of horizons that way. After I finished at the GSD, I worked for a landscape architecture firm called EDOF for about 18 months. Realized pretty quickly that that wasn't the scale that I wanted to be working at, and moved over to what was then RTKL and is now Callus and RTKL. I worked at RTKL for 6 years, working on larger scale master plans and entitlement efforts for rezonings, including a project in Fairfax, Virginia called Mosaic. And then my client, who then was Edens, hired me back in 2008, about 10 minutes before the financial crisis. And we built Mosaic, and then we built another project called Union Market. And so working at Edens, I got a ton of exposure to building systems and building codes and infrastructure and civil engineering and all these things that are, in terms of making a project, again, really sort of broadening of the mind and broadening of my knowledge and experience, so that I have a much better understanding of how you actually build, develop, finance, and entitle and lease these large, complex projects. And that's it. That's my presentation. So with that, I guess I would just add a couple final thoughts, right? Again, I started out at the outset of the presentation saying that, in terms of my inclination and interest, I've always been an urbanist, right? Someone who likes cities, who likes city making. And I would tell you that going from landscape architecture to real estate development, it just gives me a longer lever to do city making with, right? It's in terms of the skills that I get to use, in terms of like my efficacy, it's just a longer lever. The second thing I would share is, one of the things way back when that got me interested in landscape architecture was the idea that, in landscape, you really get to study and do a lot of different things. You get to wear a lot of hats. You get a pretty big tool chest in terms of ecology and design and site planning and civil engineering and sociology and urban economics and all those things that, to be a good landscape architect, even if you're not an expert in each of those fields, you have to know about them. And I would tell you that approach, that kind of multidisciplinary approach to development, like that's equally true in real estate development, right? It's just, I would tell you there are even more hats and an even bigger tool chest if you're working in real estate than if you're working in landscape architecture, whether it's thinking about entitlement or understanding land use law or thinking about how to finance these things or capital markets. Again, I'm not an expert in all those things at all. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a capital markets guy. But knowing how those things go into building these developments, makes me a more effective professional in terms of, again, building cities. And that really is the end of my presentation. So with that, happy to take any questions, and jump in any conversations that folks want to have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the great presentation. Super comprehensive, and it's actually quite it's actually quite special just to me, in a way that your background is similar to my background, similar to yours, and making this
I have a question.
Yeah. Hey Rick. Yeah, you can ask ahead.
Geoff, you hit so many of the right buttons. I'm sorry that more people aren't listening, but it really is a useful presentation. I think wherever students are in their interests. Ironically, I have a saga about your shopping center in San Jose. I was at a conference and I was flying out of the airport, and I got to the airport and they shut down the airport completely because the first case of SARS had just arrived at that airport from Hong Kong. So I had nothing to do, but I decided, well, I've got who knows how long. So I went over to your shopping center there, which was just about to open. And they had a big fire. We're talking, 15 years ago, back in 98 when it was first opened.
That's right.
And it was one of the early new urbanist centers. And the fire, I know, really set things back, and it was still a little bit before its time, but it's great to see how it has matured. And of course, it's a fabulous location. The other irony is my very first field study when I came to Harvard was teaching that federated site. I mean, the site where the Assembly Square is.
Sure.
Anyway, thanks for doing this. I'm gonna have to jump off shortly because we're about to eat, but it's great to see you, and we appreciate it. It's also great to see the students.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Rick. And I would say if folks are interested in reading more about Assembly Square, Ellen Dunham Jones recently put out a new monograph, I think called Transforming Suburbia. And there's a whole case study on Assembly Row in there, which is pretty interesting reading. So particularly if you're interested in the sort of, the process whereby the community got involved and then, how the land swaps work and all that stuff. There's a ton of great detail in that book about that project.
If you can put the author in the chat, that sounds like a useful book.
Yeah, absolutely will.
Anyway, well, thanks again for doing this.
My pleasure.
I'll say goodbye.
Take care, Rick.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you, Rick, for coming.
Thank you, Geoff, for a very interesting presentation. I had a quick question for you, but also wanted to mention that I once worked as an urban designer for a client who asked us to make him a replica of Santana Row. But in the state, no, it was great. He sent us on a field trip to document and basically copy the design. It was for a new development in Haryana, India, and this was the former owner of Hotmail who was developing a technology city in the state of Haryana. But I had a very quick question for you. I'm curious, because I have a design background in architecture, and I'm curious, what would be the role of someone with a design background in a real estate firm? And I'm curious if you have an in-house team, design team, or you work with architecture firms, you do the schematic, they do the construction documents and CA part, or how does that work?
So let me answer your question, because I think there were two parts. Let me answer it in reverse order if I can. In terms of our in-house team and how we work with our consultants, there are 3 of us at Federal, and I think we're a company of call it 300 employees. There are 3 of us, maybe 5 of us, who have some kind of design background, and probably only 2 or 3 of us actually still kind of make use of that skill set at all. In terms of how we relate to our consultants, I can tell you on that, for example, that project we were looking at with the kind of vertically stacked urban power center, the way that concept unfolded is I got out my trace and my fat pen and was sort of sketching for a while. I'm like, oh, we could do this. And then based on some napkin sketches, I reached out to a structural engineer that I know and said, hey, I want to do this. How bad is it going to be? Right? Based on his report, my napkin sketches, went to a contractor and got a very, very preliminary budget, which I could use to underwrite the project, right? To see if we could actually make some money on it. And then based on, all that information, I could put together an RFP and go out to 3 different architects to find the right one to help us with sort of real design. Now, in terms of, how that's going to work, we will absolutely trade sketches back and forth, right? They'll send me a concept, I'll mark it up, I'll send it back to them, but they're doing all the heavy lifting in terms of, studies, massing studies, blocking studies, all that stuff. They're the ones who, once we get through the entitlement process, will do all the documentation. They will, carry the weight of managing all their consultants, structural, MEP, skin, VT, code, etc. And my role is more, and this is true in general, I think, of developers, right? It's more to kind of orchestrate as opposed to do. In terms of the first part of your question, what would the role be of an architect, at a company like Federal? I would tell you that, there certainly are opportunities, particularly at larger firms that are perhaps a little more ambitious about the kinds of projects they build, to have design staff in-house. There is a risk you can get pigeonholed, however, I would say, particularly if you're good, right? If you're good, you tend to get, asked to do the same thing over and over again. And it can be sometimes a little hard to break out of that role. And so, my path was very much, within an architecture firm. I got my registration at one point, I think about 3 years after I finished with the GSD, but getting enough experience where, I could sort of play a couple of different instruments, if you know what I mean. And then when I had the opportunity to go over to Eden's back in 2008, they were sort of happy to let me sort of take on a complicated project management role, as opposed to a design role. And for me, that was a very useful path to kind of getting where I am now. I think without something like that, it's a little hard to kind of step directly from architecture into development. Again, because as I mentioned earlier, there are so many hats to wear and so much to figure out that without some understanding of those things as well, on top of your design expertise, it's a little bit of a tough sell, if that makes sense. And just one other thing to add to that. So, after I finished with the GSD, I did do additional coursework, actually at Carey Business School at Hopkins. And, did a bunch more studies in terms of real estate law and, urban economics and the residential housing market and stuff like that, which is actually, that's not something you learn at the GSD. At least it wasn't back 20 years ago. And it's super helpful in terms of knowing how all that stuff works.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you for the good questions, Alina. So I actually have a question. So how are you guys doing, during the pandemics, because you guys are very retail focused, any strategy going ahead, how are you guys dealing with the disruption right now?
So, a couple things, right? We, like every other retail landlord in the country, suffered over the past 12 months, right? And, retail rent collections, a year ago were at 50% of what they should be, per the leases. And so that's point number one. Point number two is that the way I see it, COVID is just an accelerant in terms of what's been happening in the retail industry over the past 5-10 years, right? The demise of the traditional department store, the kind of hollowing out of the middle price point segment of the box, sort of box tenants, right? There's low price point ones, but a lot of the mid price point guys are going away. Obviously, migration of sales dollars online, the rise of things like BOPIS, if that means anything to you, buy online, pick up in store. Those were all trends that were already happening. And, COVID in a way is it's like the meteor that hit when the dinosaurs were roaming 65 million years ago. And some of them evolved, right, and survived, and a lot of them didn't. And so I think, what we're going to see is continued change in the industry. And there are obviously some folks from a tenant point of view who really get that and are really capitalizing in terms of investing in whether it's new channels or new technology or new infrastructure to better reach their consumer. Or conversely, on the landlord side, it's folks who have, positioned themselves that they don't have the exposure to some of those same tenants, right? So right now, I'm very happy, for example, to be, so in the sort of retail asset class, there's the mall world and there's the open air shopping center world. Federal is definitely in the latter camp, right? We are not a mall operator or owner at all. And I'm very happy about that because malls are a very tough space to be in right now. Did I answer your question?
Yes. Yeah, right. Just, the disruption, obviously, now it's getting better. I hope things recover very soon.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're just doing for your career, it's actually, I think it's very, very interesting and actually fits, kind of I think the GSD, what the GSD intends students to do, after graduation, being able to apply the skills they have, we have acquired at school and, still pursuing making building things. I mean, that's what the school is really about. We pretty much everybody here wants the graduation, or at some point. It's very interesting conversation, and if anybody have any other questions, you shall ask ahead. We will post the recording online afterwards, and it's also just I think the low participants because it's a kind of the strange timing, at dinner time and oh, I see. Yeah, and after graduation. So yeah, but the entire thing is exceptionally great. And thank you so much for sharing with us, Geoff, for tonight's conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my pleasure, and thanks very much for having me. And listen, Penyang, if anyone on the call, sort of after the fact, thinks up questions that escape them in the moment, feel free to forward them to me, and I'm happy to answer them another time.
Yes, we will share your contact informations to anybody who's interested. Yeah, because it is intended for a lot of design background students who wants to get into real estate and see what they can do, and especially Alina's questions is actually quite a good one. Like how should designers apply our skills in a real estate industry, and how important those skills we have in our hands are, because those are I would say the initiative and some of the perspective that's holds important value to us as designers. I mean, people who come from design backgrounds in a more like I would say just straightforwardly like money-driven industry. So yeah, really appreciate the conversation today. Yeah,
of course. And I did just put my my email in the chat, so if folks want to get in touch offline, feel free to reach out. Okay.
Thank you, Geoff.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Well, thanks everyone for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Take care.